Hello, chess lovers! Welcome back to the Chess Ventura channel. In today's video, we're going to dive into a very popular opening called the London system. This opening is super simple and easy to memorize without a ton of effort. So, if you're looking for something low maintenance, this is the perfect opening for you. It starts off with white moving the pawn to d4, and black responding with pawn to d5. Then, white develops the knight to f3, black plays knight to f6, and white follows up with bishop to f4. This is what we call the London system. Typically, black will follow up with pawn to c5, knight to c6, and pawn to e6. But regardless of what black chooses to do, white usually sticks to the same pattern: pawn to e3, pawn to c3, and knight to d2. This is the basic setup you need to remember whenever you play the London system. For example, let's say black plays pawn to c5, challenging our center pawn on d4 and getting their knight ready for c6. We just respond by pushing our pawn to e3. Once the black knight goes to c6, we move our pawn to c3. What you're seeing here are the most standard building blocks of the London. Next, black often plays pawn to e6 to solidify their d5 pawn and protect the c5 pawn with their bishop. If they do that, we continue by developing our knight to d2. As you can see, white has a very strong bishop controlling the dark squares on the e5 to b8 diagonal. Because of this, black will often try to challenge it by bringing their bishop to d6. Here, we just drop our bishop back to g3, basically daring black to trade bishops on that square. If they take our bishop, we recapture with the pawn, and now the h-file is wide open, making our rook much more active. This usually makes black think twice about castling kingside. Because of that, black will usually decline the trade and just castle short. From here, we can play bishop to d3, putting direct pressure on the h7 pawn. Now black has a few options. They might play rook to e8, queen to e7, or even pawn to b6. First, let's look at what happens if black plays rook to e8, preparing to push their pawn to e5. We stop that right away by placing our knight on e5. This knight is in a great spot, controlling the center. Black can't really take it with their knight because after our pawn recaptures, black is going to lose a piece to a fork on the next move. And if black tries taking the knight with their bishop, it's still not great for them. After our pawn takes back, their knight is forced to retreat to d7. This gives white a free tempo to move the knight to f3, supporting the pawn on e5. That e5 pawn is definitely going to be a headache for black. Let's go back a bit. Usually after our knight lands on e5, black will play queen to c7 to pile more pressure on it. We simply defend it by pushing our pawn to f4. Once again, this creates a very tough position for black. Their best moves here are rook to f8 or knight to e7, but those moves are hard to find, especially for beginners. The mistake we see most often is black playing knight to d7. They want to add another attacker to our e5 knight and get ready to push their pawn to fe5. But this opens the door for a classic surprise. Bishop takes the pawn on h7, check. After the king takes the bishop, we bring our queen to h5, forcing the king back to g8, and then we take the pawn on fe7 with another check. The king moves to h7, but don't grab that rook just yet. First, give another check with the queen on h5. Once the king retreats to g8, then we take the rook with check. At this point, white is up material and the black king is wide open for an attack, so both materially and positionally, white is heavily favored to win. Now, let's rewind. We already looked at the rook to e8 line. Now, what if black plays pawn to b6, getting ready to develop their bishop to b7? We respond by pushing our pawn to e4, threatening a fork on e5. Black will usually take the pawn, we take back with our knight, and now our knight is attacking fe6 and putting pressure on their dark-squared bishop. If black decides to take our bishop on g3, we recapture with the pawn. This opens up the h-file, which is going to be incredibly dangerous for black later on. Because of that, black's best move is knight takes knight. We take back with our bishop while simultaneously attacking their other knight. Black will usually develop their bishop to b7 to support the knight on c6. Next, we take the pawn on c5, attacking their bishop and offering a trade. And again, if they take our bishop on g3, it's just bad news for black. So after the pawn trade, black has to take back with their bishop. Then we bring our queen to a4, piling even more pressure on that knight. At this point, white is doing a bit better. We have very active bishops, while black's bishops are stuck on defense. Our rook on a1 is also ready to swing over to d1 to control the open file. A typical move for black here is knight to a5. This is a very common response. Black wants to trade off our bishop and is ready to recapture with their knight if we take. But we're not going to take on b7. Instead, we slide our rook to d1, attacking their queen. This is usually where black makes a mistake. The most common blunder for black here is playing queen to e8, offering a trade. This is actually a fatal error. White has a killer move here. Bishop takes the pawn on h7, check. After the king takes, the white queen moves to h4, check again. The king only has two options: move to g6 or retreat to g8. If the king goes to g6, then knight to e5 is another check. The king is forced to f5, and then queen to f4 is checkmate. So after the check on h4, the king has to retreat to g8. Then we bring our knight to ji5, threatening mate on h7. The only way to stop that mate is by playing bishop to e4. We just take that bishop with our queen, and the mate threat on h7 is still there. On top of that, white is also threatening to play pawn to b4 to fork the knight and the dark-squared bishop. From here, white is winning easily. Let's go back for a moment. After our knight moves to d2, we've already seen what happens with bishop to d6. Now let's look at another popular move. Bishop to e7. Just like before, we develop our bishop to d3. After black castles, we jump our knight to e5, baiting them to trade knights. If black trades immediately, we take back with the pawn, attacking their knight on f6. The knight has to retreat to d7. Then we push our pawn to h4, threatening to go to h5 next. Black can't really take that pawn with their bishop because we'd play queen to h5, attacking the bishop and threatening mate on h7. Black is guaranteed to lose a piece. In this spot, the most logical moves for black are pawn to c4, pawn to fe5, or queen to b6. If black plays pawn to c4 to attack our bishop, white has another surprise sacrifice. Bishop takes the pawn on h7, check. After the king takes, the queen goes to h5, forcing the king back to g8. Then we bring our knight to f3, with the plan of jumping to g5 to launch a massive attack. Even if black tries to stop it with pawn to f6, we play knight to g5 anyway. If they don't take the knight, it's mate in two moves. So, if black takes the knight, we recapture with our pawn. Now the threat is pawn to g6 followed by queen to h8 mate. If they try to stop it with rook to f5, we just play queen to h7 check. The king moves to f7, then we play pawn to g6, check again. Once the king moves to e8, we take the pawn on e7. White has so many ways to attack from here. We can play rook to h8 or even pawn to g4. Honestly, if you can't win from this position, that would be truly baffling. Let's head back one more time. After white plays pawn to c3, we've seen the lines where black plays pawn to e6. But what if black brings their bishop out to g4, pinning our knight to the queen? We just respond with knight to d2, reinforcing that f3 knight. After black plays pawn to e6, we'd usually move our bishop to d3. But in this specific variation, we're going to bring our queen to a 4. This pins black's knight on c6 and gets our own pieces out of that annoying pin. Now white is threatening knight to e5 to pile on the c6 knight, or even bishop to b5. A very common mistake for black here is playing bishop to d6 to stop our knight from jumping to e5. But this is a huge blunder because white has the killer move, bishop to a6. If black is brave enough to take the bishop, we take their knight with check. You can see our queen is now attacking the bishop on d6, the pawn, and the rook on a8 all at once. Or, if they take our bishop on f4, we just take their pawn with our bishop. Once again, 3 of black's pieces are hanging, and they're definitely going to lose one of them. If black tries to castle, we just take the knight on c6. After the rook moves out of the way, we can recapture the bishop on f4. At this stage, white is up a whole piece and is totally winning. Alright, chess fans, that's a quick look at how to play the London system. I hope this video helps you improve your game. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next chess video.